All right, welcome back to class. In this lecture, I'm going to begin my review of Judges, Kingship, and the Mission of God. In this two-part series, I'm going to explore from the book of Judges through 1 Samuel 12. We can essentially understand this as an overview of the Judges period because the beginning of the book of Samuel presents Samuel as the last judge and the tradition and the transition that takes place to monarchy with the calling of King Saul. But let's jump in and begin first of all with the book of Judges itself, and let's take a look at how Judges fits into the mission of God. Now, in the previous lecture, if you're watching these consecutively, I talked about the book of Joshua and how Joshua's generation is the model for faithfulness and also for success in achieving what God has called God's people to do. But something dramatically shifts with the beginning of the book of Judges. As I mentioned in that previous lecture, the Judges 1, and really this rolls all the way into chapter 2 of Judges, the beginning of it, we have introductory materials that are related to Israel's failure to take the land. And so they are being pushed back and they're unable to actually take the land that when you read Joshua, it sort of sounds like they already had possession of. Now, I want to read chapter 2, verses 1 to 5 for a second to give you a taste of what's going on here. Because what's interesting is at this moment, there's no figure that can speak. There's no Joshua that has risen up with this next generation. And so God sends an angel of the Lord to actually prophesy. So chapter 2, verse 1, "Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up from the land of Egypt and brought you into the land that I had promised to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done. So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their God shall be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the Israelites, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named their place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to the Lord." Now, notice the issue here. It's about Israel's disobedience that's led to this failure to take the land. It wasn't simply that the Canaanites were stronger or anything else. And so Israel's success rises and falls on the issue of faithfulness. God's unconditional grace to Israel, the call, the promises, God's will make them happen. But what this period is going to represent is a period in which God's mission is actually going to go backwards because God's people don't step into the moment and practice faithfulness. And that's a good word and a powerful word for us today. God's mission will be ultimately successful. God's kingdom is coming in its fullest consummation, but one of the things that is critical is the faithfulness of God's people in living as, essentially the way I'd say as a Christian, is living as Jesus' hands, feet, and mouthpieces in the world. So that's the beginning of the book of Judges. Then we get a block from 2:6 to 16:31 that describes the era of the Judges, where we're going to get 2:6 to 3:6, which gives an overarching view of a cycle of disobedience and failure that's going to essentially be a cyclical movement that we'll see. Then we have a series of good judges, Othniel, Ehud, Deborah. Then there's a transitional period in this middle section, chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. Essentially, we'll cover Gideon and also Abimelech, his son, in an attempt to start a monarchy. Then chapter 10, we shift to bad judges that are explicitly bad, Jephthah and Samson. And then the book ends with just a series of really troubling stories where you see the disintegration of God's people that essentially serves as an apologetic for the need for a king who will model faithfulness. Go back and look at Joshua. Look at Joshua 1:1-9 in particular, and then read Joshua's speech in 23 and 24. That's what faithful leadership looks like. The judges are sort of anti-leaders. They're going to act for God, for the sake of God's people. But as we're going to move through here, the judges this whole period disintegrates into chaos, which we'll see at the very end of the book. Okay, so the judges, 1 step forward, 3 steps back is the way I like to say it. And it's a downward spiral. Again, there's a contrast with the generation of Joshua. And really, it's a bigger contrast if you want to think about it for a minute. So notice the generations, and this could be its own lecture, that take place here. There's the Exodus generation. These are the people that were actually delivered from Egypt. That generation ultimately fails in the wilderness, and they all die off, except for Joshua and Caleb. Even Moses doesn't make it to the promised land. Then Joshua's generation models faithfulness, and then this next generation kind of disintegrates. So we just want to notice a couple of things. A bad generation doesn't necessarily create a bad generation, because Joshua's generation arose after a generation that failed, but also a good generation like Joshua's doesn't automatically create another good generation. So we just want to notice these bigger macro things as we read the scriptures. The issue is faithful obedience. Again, that's the critical mark that takes place here. And the other thing is we want to notice the book of the law. The book of the law is mentioned in Joshua, but what's interesting, the book of the law is going to be rediscovered late in 2 Kings during the reign of Josiah. But what I want you to notice, and you can read through those books, the book of the law seems to have disappeared. There's going to be prophets that show up. Already mentioned an angel in chapter 2. But where's the book of the law that Joshua was supposed to meditate on day and night? It seems to have disappeared somehow. So was it there? Was it lost? But it's interesting that one of the key exhortations from Joshua, book of the law, is not going to be mentioned at all in Judges or Samuel. We're not going to see it again till Kings. Okay, so we mentioned back in the previous lecture on Joshua, on just biblical materials about the conquest, what Judges 1 was talking about, and again, early successes move to failures. Why the failures? Again, the issue was faithfulness. I already read the words of the angel of the Lord, and this is chapter 2, verses 1-5 that we looked at. Again, Israel is having problems because they disobeyed God's words, God's law. And in particularly, notice they did, and this is going to be an ongoing mark. It says, "You shall break down their altars, yet you have disobeyed me." So one of the great drivers, go back to the opening talk on prophets, Israel's unfaithful in terms of idolatry and also injustice. And so it's always going to go back to those two themes. And here it's highlighted in particularly the issue of idolatry, leaving the other gods out, and they become snares for Israel. Okay, let's talk about 2:6 to 3:6. And I would suggest, if you haven't read that chapters in a while, that you want to take a look at them, because what we see is a cyclical pattern of sin, oppression. Usually Israel cries out for help. A judge is sent by the Lord to deliver God's people. And then you have deliverance, and then the cycle repeats. Again, the background here would be chapter 2, verses 6 to 10, and we want to take a look at that. After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land. each to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance, at Timnath Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. So we get a reminder that Joshua's generation did great. They took possession, each to their own inheritance, that they served the Lord, all of that. But then a generation grows up who doesn't know the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. So there hadn't been, technical word, there hadn't been catechesis done. There hadn't been discipleship done. There hadn't been education done to actually make sure the next generation was grounded in a relationship with God based on what God had done for God's people in the past, principally those acts of deliverance from Egypt, the calling and promises to the ancestors, the guidance through the wilderness, the Passover, and the gift of the land. And so there's no vision for that. Now, the whole era gets summed up this way. Again, the problem is going to ultimately be idolatry. Let's look at how this gets summed up, beginning at chapter 2, verse 20. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors did. The Lord had allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. So this ends up being a mixed bag where there's cycles of deliverance, disobedience, over and over again because God's people are unable to keep the covenant, which again, they're called to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Holiness matters. Go back to the entrance into the land. It wasn't about might. It was about Israel making sure everybody was circumcised, practicing Passover, and then Joshua himself in chapter 5 was taught the lesson that holiness matters. Okay, then we get the stories, and anyone who's been in Sunday school at some point probably remembers some of the stories of the judges and the popular ones. And it starts with 3 judges. 2 of them are probably a little less known. Deborah's stories are often taught. She's one of the first prominent female leaders in the Old Testament. We saw Miriam back in the Exodus. You have the wives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but Deborah is authentically the head leader of Israel for a season here. But we have Othniel 3:7-11, a very short account, but Othniel succeeds massively and delivers God's people. And we see the cycle of Israel committing sin, God raising up a judge to save them, them being delivered, and then the cycle begins to repeat. Followed by a really intriguing story about Ehud, who's an assassin, a left-handed assassin who delivers God's people from Eglon, the king of Moab. And then that story is followed by Deborah, and we have an extended narrative about Deborah and the victory over King Jabin and the things that happen. Sisera, you have all of the fights that take place under Deborah's leadership. And what's really cool also is you have both a narrative and a poetic version of this. Those of you who are familiar with the Old Testament, maybe watching these videos in sequence, back in Exodus 14 and 15, we saw the same thing. A description of the Red Sea crossing and then poetry celebrating the victory at the Red Sea crossing. So we get a description of Deborah's victory in chapter 4, and then we get poetry about Deborah's victory in chapter 5. So those are the good judges. And then at this point, a transition is made. And the transition involves Gideon and one of Gideon's sons. Now, Gideon, at least in the kids' story, which is usually what gets focused on in Sunday school, wins that dramatic victory. He's a reluctant leader, but he wins a great victory. But first, his account is framed out with a prophet. This is our initial example of a prophetic speech. The angel in chapter 2 is kind of a prophet, but here we have a prophet. And this is what's going to happen through Joshua, or through Judges, Samuel, and Kings. God's going to send prophets to call God's people back. So when the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, the Lord sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you've not listened to me." So that's the backdrop for ultimately the calling of Gideon. And but the issue, again, notice it's a lack of faithfulness in contrast to what God's done for them. And in this case, because of Midian, the people cry out, and God calls up Gideon, who again uses a dramatically reduced force and wins an incredible victory out against a much larger force that demonstrates that God literally is winning this victory for Israel through the work of Gideon. Now, that's awesome. And up till that point, you could say Gideon is a good judge, but then I have it listed as transitional because Gideon ends up being a mixed bag. A lot of times we don't keep reading the Gideon story after all these things happen, because Gideon does do what he's supposed to. He calls he calls forth an army. He cuts down a pole that's dedicated to Baal. He routs the Midianites, and Israel wins this great victory. But then you get to chapter 8, and things shift. And what happens in chapter 8 is his life ends up badly. First of all, he refuses kingship. That's a good thing. But then what he does, it's so strange, is he then leads Israel back into idolatry by crafting for himself an ephod, some kind of divination device that ends up being a snare to God's people. And so the question ends up being, was he a good judge or not? And, by the way, he has this other name too, Jerubbaal. So even before he was Gideon, he has a name that has Baal in it. So it's just an interesting that Gideon himself represents this part good, part bad, which is the problem with Israel as a whole. And Gideon, though he wins a great victory, ends up being a judge who leads Israel back into idolatry. Now, we're going to pause at this point before we talk about Abimelech, but want you to just notice the pattern here. Israel's had some good judges, but the pattern that's taken place here, which is sin, oppression, sending a judge, deliverance. It doesn't just keep Israel in the same place. What's actually happening during this era of the judges is it's actually a spiral that's slowly moving them backwards. Yeah, Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, positive force, but still not getting Israel to go forward. But beginning with Gideon, his son, and then the last judges, we're going to start seeing history go backwards a little bit, and we'll see how the end of the book of Judges is actually going to be an argument why a centralized king is going to be needed. And we'll pick this up in part 2 of this lecture on Judges. All right, welcome back to class. This is part 2 of the lecture, Judges, Kingship, and the Mission of God. We ended last time by talking about the mixed bag that was Gideon. Now, I've also included his son Abimelech as a transitional figure as part of this mixed bag, but let's be clear, Abimelech was evil. He's one of Gideon's sons, but he was a son of Gideon through the